All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Welcome to the HAI Research Seminar. I'm Vanessa Parley, Director of Research Programs here at HAI, and I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker for today, Nick Haber. Nick is Assistant Professor at the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford and by courtesy computer science. After receiving his PhD in mathematics on partial differential equation theory, he worked on Senshin, a company that applied computer vision to online education. He then co-founded the Autism Glass Project here at Stanford, and a research effort that employs wearable technology and computer vision in a tool for children with autism. And in his research group, they develop artificial intelligence systems meant to mimic and model the ways people learn early in life, exploring their environments through play, social interaction, and curiosity. There's a museum called Curiosity, and now I keep getting in today's seminar, Nick will cover a number of efforts aimed at assembling a motif for intelligence to create autonomous agents, including his work inspired by biology and in particular human development. So before we begin the presentation, a few logistics for our Zoom audience. You can use the Zoom chat to message the group, but please use the link for Slido to ask questions. I'll have the Slido thread up so we can look at your questions during the Q&A. There's the upvote feature on Slido, so I can see which questions are most popular. And then for our in-person audience, we'll be going back and forth between online questions and in-person. We have mics on the side of the room for questions after the presentation. All right, I think that's it. Let's begin. Welcome, Nick.
Okay. All right. So the dramatic advances in artificial intelligence over the past decade, several years in particular, have brought us closer and closer to be able to make these sorts of autonomous agents. But what do I mean by autonomous agents? Well, if you ask ChatGPT, you'll get an answer something like an artificial agent capable of doing all kinds of stuff without needing humans too much. I guess I'm exaggerating a little bit. ChatGPT is a good deal more eloquent than that, but it's still really a quite vague definition, right? What kinds of stuff? What's too much? And how does it become autonomous? So I like to be inspired by biology here. We looked at biology to tell us how to precisely define the intelligence that we are trying to create. So in what ways are humans autonomous? Well, I draw a lot from developmental psychology in particular, including from our colleague here, Carol Dweck. Humans are intrinsically motivated. They have drive. This intrinsic motivation pushes us to satisfy certain core needs and is ever present. Humans are also autotelic. They come up with their own goals in service of this basic motivation. I'm particularly inspired by this sort of behavior, play behavior. We play physically with our environments and also socially with others. And we hypothesize in doing so, build these sorts of world models of our environments through play and exploration. This video gets a lot of play in these sorts of talks. It's fascinating, right? So we have this sort of blueprint for the autonomous agent. You collect data through interaction with the environment. You have these powerful world models learned through data. And with that behavior driven by intrinsic motivation, in particular, based on these sorts of needs, maybe instrumental needs, informational needs, the ability to anticipate and manipulate the surrounding environment, social needs, belonging, reciprocity. The agent has intrinsic motivation associated with these needs. Importantly, this is a low-dimensional set of ever-present drives. And with that, you get this data-driven emergence of more sophisticated goals. But so there's something missing from this picture, and a piece that I think we've been all grappling with over the past couple of years in particular. We get a lot of help. We have these culturally propagated and evolved cognitive tools that help us learn along the way. So here's our blueprint. And in this talk, I want to answer several questions that we've been attacking in my research group towards this, maybe make some progress towards answering these kinds of questions, at least. How can intrinsic motivation lead to emergent, sophisticated play behaviors and world model representations? How can autonomous agents employ their world models adaptively? And how should culturally propagated cognitive tools be integrated so as to allow agents to set their own goals, plan, and execute? So towards this first question, I want to start with some work led by Chris Doyle, together with Sarah Shader, Michelle Lau, and Meg Sano, in a collaboration with Dan Yeamans. And this work, by the way, was funded in large part by an HII Hoffman-Yee grant, so thank you a lot for your support. So we were particularly interested in this case in understanding intrinsic motivation and the emergence of social play. Take a behavior like this, for instance. A baby rolling a ball back and forth with a caregiver. If you think about it, this is incredibly complex behavior. One serves, the other returns. They execute this mutually contingent play behavior. They both need to play along in order for this to work at all. And it's this learned behavior. You see this happen throughout early development, right? All sorts of contingent-based behavior between a child and caregiver. These sorts of contingent behaviors, and serve and return, colloquially called, is really a critical building block of social learning. And so this is really quintessential interactive learning, right? The data obtained strongly depends on playing along. You have to be able to mutually contingently play together. Can these be emergent behaviors for intrinsically motivated agents? So in order to answer this question, we created this 3D virtual environment using Unity, in which a caregiver can interact with an infant. And you can see the caregiver sort of throwing a ball at the infant, it can bat it back. So we have a caregiver, we have this baby infant with these robot arms, and we have toys, balls in particular, that they can play with. The infant has a partial field of view. It has to be able to look forward, and it can only see those observations. And so in order to create this sort of contingent behavior, we want the infant to learn how to play with the caregiver. But for simplicity, we hard-coded the caregiver's behaviors to engage in a set of play behaviors, right? Hide, roll, and chase. And I think the particulars of how this is implemented is maybe a little less important than kind of the overall structure I'm getting at here, which is that the infant needs to execute this initial gesture in order to get the caregiver to start a given behavior. And then there is a contingency back and forth between them. So the caregiver takes a certain kind of action, and in order for the play behavior to continue, the infant needs to figure out the right contingent action to do in return. At least in the hide and roll cases, chase is a little bit more autonomous. And so how do we design an agent that engages in all of these contingent behaviors through a generic motivation? Let me introduce a framework for curiosity that we'll be using for all of this. So the agent is interacting with an environment. It has a world model. In this case, you can think very concretely that what this world model is doing is predicting the next observation that the infant agent sees, given action and past observations. And it has a policy, which in this case is trying to implement, how do I act so as to be curious? And the key idea here is to make this a self-supervised reinforcement learning problem. That is, we're going to have a reward function that is passed to the policy. And in particular, this reward function is not something that's going to come from the external environment, but rather is going to be something that can be computed by the agent itself. And in particular, you want to think of it somehow as being based off of the world model. This is by no means, by the way, a totally new framework. Odia and Kaplan, as well as Schmidt-Huber, really pioneered this sort of work. And we've seen a real flurry of activity in intrinsic motivation and curiosity and reinforcement learning latter half of the past decade into today. So how do we decide what to be curious about? What should the intrinsic motivation reward be? Do we look at what's most novel? What's most difficult? What we can't make our minds up about? What we think we can learn the most from? Or do we simply act randomly? So these are intuitive notions of curiosity. We can implement computational versions of these. Random network distillation is meant to be a version of novelty and continuous action space. Adversarial curiosity is perhaps the simplest one to understand, right? The world model is trying to minimize a certain loss to be correct, and the policy is trying to maximize that loss. So it plays an adversarial game, one making the other's life as hard as possible, basically. Disagreement is a technique from standard active learning, if you're familiar with in more traditional statistical and machine learning literature. You make an ensemble of world models and compute some notion of how much they disagree in order to get some sense of uncertainty. You might imagine that curiosity should imbue some notion of progress that I can learn from my examples. Being able to estimate how much progress I think I can make for a given example is quite difficult. So there are various ways of approximating notions of progress, and we've implemented a couple in this work. So in this environment, putting it all together, right, we have this intrinsically motivated agent that's going to be learning in an environment with a hard-coded caregiver, and we want to see the extent to which and how they can engage in this sort of contingent play behavior. So how does the choice of intrinsic motivation signal affect the emergent behavior? Well, we are able to get the different sorts of behaviors we set out to get. You can kind of see them playing, rolling, hide and seek, and chase. There are idiosyncrasies corresponding to the particular intrinsic motivation signal. But I think on a higher level, different intrinsic motivations lead to really drastically different behavior allocations here. So what I'm plotting here are each column is a different intrinsic motivation signal, as I described. The x-axes here are time, and the y-axes, I'm plotting several different seeds of the amount of time spent in each kind of activity. So hide is blue, roll is orange, chase is green, and independent play, basically anything else, is red. And so I want you to notice a couple of things here. One, that there are certain signals, I think R&D and disagreement in particular, that are relatively balanced. They're able to engage in an array of different play behaviors with some balance and quite different temporal dynamics. Whereas the progress signals, to more extent than another, engage in more independent play with some diversity. Whereas adversarial is really quite myopic towards the role behavior. And in fact, when we looked at what this agent was doing, it was sort of doing one of two things. One is sort of like playing baseball, and as you might expect, trying to just make things as chaotic as possible. It's something of a chaos agent, or sort of juggling the ball around. So it was sort of just looking for things that it could find as difficult or as difficult as possible. And another thing I want you to notice here is that there's a lot of heterogeneity between different intrinsic motivation signals, but relative homogeneity within individual motivation signals. That is, if I give you an additional seed of one of these, you could probably tell me which intrinsic motivation signal it came from. So we get this really diverse but somewhat typified behavior within intrinsic motivation signals. How does intrinsic motivation then affect the world model representations learned? In particular, how do we test world models? We don't have a particular data set that we care about here, so we've got to come up with a method for figuring out how to grade a world model and how good it is. So we train the agent for 20 million steps and test the resulting world models on first hard-coded infant agent behaviors that typify each of these contingent play behaviors. So we just went in and hard-coded policies. And then we also did a sort of round robin, where we took data collected from held-out agents of each intrinsic motivation type and had agents of every intrinsic motivation type test those. So for instance, you gather data using a disagreement agent, and you test an agent that had an adversarial intrinsic motivation during training. So I guess an intuition with this, so two intrinsic motivations, right, that give rise to very non-overlapping behaviors should perform well on their own data, but not the others. And also intrinsic motivations that generate balanced, diverse behaviors should do fairly well on all. So what do we see here? Well, if we look in aggregate performance, both on the round-robin agent-generated data as well as the manually generated data represented in different colors here, the intrinsic motivation used during training, well, you see on the x-axis really changes considerably the sorts of performance. So we're seeing loss on the y-axis, so lower is better. Kind of corresponding to the balanced, diverse behaviors that you see, disagreement, R&D, and maybe to a lesser extent, delta progress come out ahead in this comparison. And if you break things down by the round-robin approach here, so what I'm showing here vertically is the intrinsic motivation used during training for the world model, and horizontally here, intrinsic motivation used to collect data. a couple of things to note here, right? The disagreement in R&D, again, seems to be fairly dominant in this round-robin experiment. And adversarial generates the hardest data overall, but that doesn't lead to good performance even on its own data. You can think of this as kind of like a, from developmental psychology, like a zone of proximal development issue, or from, I guess people call this like the white noise problem in machine learning. It's generating data that's too difficult for it to deal with. So in summary for this part, right, we implemented this contingent social play environment, saw these diverse contingent behaviors emerge as a result of intrinsic motivation, and from that saw this link, right? Richer, more diverse behaviors led to more robust prediction of the external social world. This is in line with some earlier work of ours. We looked at, in 2018, physical play. So we basically set up a playroom for agents, gave them some toys, and had them play with them. It was a non-social thing. It was just entirely physical. So we saw through intrinsic motivation, you get approaching objects, persistent play with objects, gathering objects. And again, richer, more diverse behaviors here led to better transfer to visual detection, localization, and classification tasks. We also set up an early social attention environment, where you want to think of this as like baby's first environment. It's just kind of sitting there and it can direct its attention at things, but it can't really do anything else. And in this, we put various stimuli around it. Some of the stimuli were more predictable than others. Some of the stimuli were more animate than others. And we found that there was, at least for certain intrinsic motivation signals, a preferential attention to animate stimuli, and that this animate attention gave for a better ability to predict stimuli overall. So we can learn world models through intrinsic motivation, but what can we do with them? Well, recent successes in model-based reinforcement learning has given us increasingly robust techniques for using world models to plan. There's been a real flurry of these sorts of results. Let me just highlight a few that'll be relevant going forward. The Dreamer series. This has been a popular series of model-based reinforcement learning papers. The basic idea is that the agent learns to predict an environment in a latent encoding, and then dreams within this latent space in order to learn policy. So it learns the dynamics and then is able to simulate things in order to figure out what it should do. This leads to good performance and sample efficiency gains. Basically, you get this kind of computational trade-off. You're milking the data for all it's worth by building this world model that allows you to do things with less data at increased computation costs relative to other deep reinforcement learning algorithms. What about training a world model with intrinsic motivation and then using that to plan downstream tasks? So Plan to Explore is a work I would like to introduce here that did this and will be an important baseline in going forward. So it uses intrinsic motivation to train a world model. In particular, it's training a dreamer type model. And then it uses the world model on downstream tasks. So sort of as you might expect a baby to do, right? It plays, it learns about its world, and then it's able to do all sorts of things as a result. As a result, the agent can quickly adapt to new tasks in the same environment. So we have this blueprint for autonomous agents here. And on to the second question there, how can autonomous agents employ their world models adaptively? In particular, we want to ask, can we make model-based reinforcement learners, and in particular, these intrinsically motivated world model learners, that efficiently use their world models as environments change? So this work, which is led by Isaac here, and also, by the way, it was supported by HAI in a seed grant together with Carl Dijsselroth. So thanks again for your support on this. Isaac is an interesting guy. He comes from Carl's lab originally, is now on a postdoc in my group, and he was really interested from a biologic perspective. What is curiosity? What is adaptation? And so, all right, in Carl's group, we work with mice. So we set up this experiment. These are, by the way, Carl's mice. The GSC doesn't have mice, at least not on purpose. So you have an unchanging condition where the mouse is placed in a room with a ball, and it can just explore. And then you have the changing condition. The mouse explores an empty room, and then a ball is placed inside. So the question is, how much does the mouse investigate the ball in each case? So intuitively here, in the unchanging environment, you'd expect that the whole environment is new and interesting, so it should explore the ball and the rest of the room in a fairly balanced way. In the changing condition, however, the rest of the room is sort of old hat. It's already seen it. So you should expect it to explore the ball more. And that's indeed what we see. What we have in these bar plots here comparing the unchanging and changing conditions, the changing one approaches the ball more consistently, more quickly. Here we're seeing the overall time series of how much it's investigating the ball. So the mouse here is engaging in behavior consistent with an agent that knows what it doesn't know and explores efficiently as the environment changes. So what happens when we put a state-of-the-art intrinsically motivated world model learner in such an environment? So we built this novel object assay environment off of DeepMind control to test this. Here, the agent is not a mouse, it's a ball. The ball can move forward, it can turn around. And it has this object here, a ball that it can explore, it can run into. Very simple environment, right? And we put plan to explore in that. And what we see is actually, right, where here's the time to the fifth interaction, works over 500. But what we see here is that in the changing setting, it actually takes a lot more time to start investigating the ball. So we get the opposite behavior. In the changing environment, plan to explore pays less attention to the ball. So why is this? Well, if we look at the world model here, what I'm plotting here is that the ground truth of basically the agent just approaching the ball. And the second row there is what's imagined by plan to explore, right? The world model can roll out it can simulate the environment. And the simulation basically falls apart, and it looks maybe a little washed out in this screen, but the ball basically disappears and it reverts to a ball-free environment. So the model doesn't know what it doesn't know when looking at imagined rollouts. How do we fix this? Well, so I think it's perhaps no surprise that these sorts of techniques don't work as expected here, or as one might hope here. Right. So the way that plan to explore and other such techniques work is that it's gathering data from the world model, and the world model is updated with uniform sampling from a replay buffer. This is typical. This is a typical model update mechanism, and it works really well when it's sampling independently from a stationary environment. When we're no longer here, it sort of breaks down. If there are certain examples that are more interesting than others and important to pay attention to because things are changing, you're going to have really poor optimization characteristics. So what we sought to do was change the prioritization, and in particular do so using curiosity. So we made what we term curious replay, which is prioritize replay with curiosity. That is, you want to learn from the most novel and surprising experiences. So what we did here is, as the agent sees data, it's going to update on that data with some probability p, and that's dependent on a novelty novelty term, basically just that decays the more it sees the data, and on a loss-based term. So some notion of surprisal. The data that was more difficult for it coming in should get seen more often. This is, by the way, not the first time people have thought a lot about prioritization in replay. So prioritize experience replay is a key baseline here, and it uses value-based temporal difference error. So we'll, in following slides, refer to this as TD. So how does curious replay behave in this novel object assay? Well, we basically get what we want, surprise. Once the object is introduced, we get drastically more exploration than various baselines. You can see, again, like the number of steps to fifth interaction in the changing environment really goes up for our algorithm. You also get better reconstruction on imagined rollouts. It sort of fixes the issue that we saw before. It's noticing that the ball is there and that it should investigate it. So curious replay can allow us to get adaptive behavior inspired by biology, but is it generally useful? In particular, does curious replay consistently outperform baselines in environments with a step change at a single time point? And how about in more open world environments with more complex series of changes? So towards this first question, we made a couple of benchmarks to this. We modified, if you're familiar with distracting control suite, basically distracting control suite and DeepMind control suite overall are these continuous control tasks. You want to, for instance, get the ball in this cup. So we made constrained control suite for which during a certain period of time at the beginning, the agent is constrained, in this case, basically so that it can't solve the task at all. And then that constraint is released and it tries to solve it from there. We also made a background swap control suite, which is what sounds like. So DeepMind control consists of this walker walk, which basically you just have this embodied walker and you want it to walk forward. In background swap control suite, we basically just change the background over time. After a certain period of time, you change it, and then we change it back. So in the constraint control suite, we find that pretty uniformly, the curious replay can adapt more quickly and solve the task. Once the constraint is released, it's able to adjust much more quickly. In the background swap control suite, we find that, so what we're plotting here is on the x-axis time, and the dotted lines indicate when the background is swapped. So those are the step changes in the environments. And the curious replay can adapt better to the new background. So basically, you're seeing the red lines shoot up faster in between the two dotted lines. And it doesn't forget the old background. That is when during the second step change, you don't see any loss in performance. So these are nice but fairly toy environments. We wanted to explore something more complex, sophisticated. So we explored Crafter, which is this open world survival game benchmark meant to test adaptation to new capabilities. So in this, it's sort of a Minecraft type thing. You can eat, sleep, and drink while being chased by skeletons and zombies. I forgot to put zombies. In doing this, you can craft these new objects, these new tools, and there is this complex chain of skills for building useful tools. Right, this is kind of from a reinforcement learning perspective a real nightmare because you have to learn successive skills in order to be able to make the sword and beat off the skeletons. So. What we found was that curious replay here obtained by a considerable margin this state-of-the-art over previous benchmarks. And the way that it did so was basically that it was able to consistently discover these skills much more quickly, right? You think of these as intuitively being the sorts of changes that you need to be adapting to, and it's able to consistently do much better at finding these new skills. So when we showed people this work, I think people were excited, but there was one bit of consistent feedback that we got, which can be summarized as something in the form, that's great and all, but have you thought about using language model, right? I joke, but I guess I'm also not joking, right? These things have become part of our lives. Over the past year or so, in fact, even the term autonomous agent seems to have been repurposed a bit to indicate a language model-enabled agent. And so, we have this overall blueprint, and we come to this last question: how should culturally propagated cognitive tools be integrated so as to allow agents to set their own goals, plan, and execute? In particular, maybe to put it more simply, how do we integrate language models? And there's been a real flurry of activity recently that gives us some sense of how we should be doing this. And here's a woefully incomplete list, just to give you some vague sense of what's going on in this domain overall. We've had a number of papers in planning that go from using language models to come up with high-level plans towards more end-to-end systems that use language models as an interface, natural interface for interaction with a human. We've seen coming out of Stanford this simulacra work, right, where you make this multi-agent system, have them interact, and they generate fairly believable behaviors. And these aren't learning agents; they're just making decisions based off of language models, playing different roles. We've also seen a lot of work on multi-role generation, I'll call, which I guess an example would be this meta GPT, which is basically you want to be able to generate something like code, and it appears to be a useful motif that you you assign a bunch of agents different roles. These are all language model agents, and they work together to complete the overall objective. We've also seen exploratory and autotelic agents, with Cedric, lead author here, being a real driver in a lot of this work. Using language models to come up with goals to both help you explore environments as well as discover new skills. It's really this dramatic tension of AI efforts, right? You have on one hand this simple motif for intelligent life, where there are these smaller set of motivations, there is representational capacity, and from that, emergent representations, behaviors, complex goal setting. On the other hand, you have this embracing of these culturally propagated and evolved cognitive tools and messy evolution, right? You can think of this as like, the top is sort of what DeepMind was promising up until very recently, right? Like everything is going to be solved using reinforcement learning, versus basically what everybody has like suddenly gotten into, which is trying to use these sorts of language model tools for decision-making mechanisms. So how do we resolve this tension and incorporate language models in autonomous agents? It's a really exciting time to do this. Okay, so in order to do this, bear with me for a second. I want to put forth this notion of coding, as writing code, as a model of coming up with and executing on goals. Right, coding is grounded, just like embodied interaction is grounded. We can execute code as well as come up with and apply test cases and evaluations. Coding also requires really rich planning, and it appears to be useful for people to work at multiple levels of abstraction, come up with sub-goals, and use modular decomposition of problems. So how should an autonomous agent code? Many of you are probably familiar with now tools such as GitHub Copilot. It's sort of an autocomplete tool in which you can type code, type comments, and it attempts to automatically generate code as a result of that. Right? So is this the right way to generate code? There's a lot of reasons to believe that this sort of line-by-line approach has a lot of problems to it. So the original authors of Codex that started a lot of this stuff knew this. They made this experiment where they basically wanted to have it generate a series of simple string manipulations. And it turned out that the more string manipulations you added on to this series, the less likely it was, dramatically, you see this dramatic fall off, to get a correct program generated in this way. So each line of code generated is a chance to introduce a bug. But when human experts make code, they don't simply think line by line like this. They decompose coding problems into easier subproblems, use abstractions to plan how everything goes together, and they implement. So what if we get code generation to work in this way? So I introduced Parcel, algorithmic reasoning with language models by composing decompositions. That's a pun. If you get it, you get a star. It's led by Eric Zeligman, who's fantastic. I think you'll be seeing a whole lot more of him, together with Tian, Gabe, and Noah Goodman. And it works like this. So either a human coder or something else can decompose a coding problem into subproblems, all in natural language. Just saying, first this needs to happen, then this needs to happen, then this needs to happen. Think of it as like pseudocode, very bare pseudocode. You can potentially put in test cases as well. This we call a parcel program. And then we've made this parcel synthesizer, which can take this and make calls to a code language model and stitch together a solution. Now, how it's doing that synthesizing, there's a lot of tricks to that, and I won't go into full details for the sake of time, but just on a very high level, basically, right, you start with this kind of parcel decomposition. This is for computing collapse numbers, if you're familiar with that. And so this is the parcel code. So it automatically comes up with names for it, as well as test cases for it. You can also implement test cases, and it's helpful if you do so. And then it does like a kind of bottom-up construction of the code, right? Once it has the high-level plan, it's going to code bottom-up. It's going to make language model calls to get potential implementations. It grounds those calls using test cases in order to figure out what's potentially right. when there are dependencies, it makes sure that things are working together as well as individually using those test cases. Some things are wrong, some things are right, but because of this modularity, it gets a lot of possibilities for getting things correct. And that ends up being very useful. Once it's able to find a solution, it can stitch it together. So just to kind of drive this home, here's an example problem, and it's one that's like, I guess, from introductory computer science, and it's a fun one, right? You have these cities. You need to connect all these cities together, and you can do so by either building a road, which has a cost. You can see the cost of 5 going one city to the other, or by building an airport. And building each airport has a cost as well. And you want to connect all the cities with the least cost. So there's a trick to this. I'll give it away. You say the sky is a new city. You draw lines to the sky and say those are new roads, and the cost of building those roads is the cost of building an airport. And this reduces the problem to a simple graph computational problem, right? Now you're just saying, I want to connect all of these. I want to connect all of these cities together with the least number of edges. So you can describe this in natural language. This is Parcel. And then a synthesizer makes the code from it. So this is a much more general framework. I've been focusing on code, and the entire previous time I was talking about embodied interaction of agents. So what does this have to do with anything? But it's a much more general framework of decomposing problems and then composing solutions. So with minimal changes, we're able to use this sort of Parcel this methodology to do robotic planning. What you're seeing on the left-hand side is the Parcel version of a robotic plan, and then an executable plan on the right-hand side, as well as doing theorem proving. So you have Parcel on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, the actual proof. So it's really the same principle of decomposing things, solving things individually and stitching things back together. So how do we make this autonomous, right? If we prompt an LLM to come up with high-level Parcel plans, then use the Parcel synthesizer, how does this compare to have a language model generate code end-to-end? So in particular, what we're interested in here is how efficient Parcel is at generating correct programs as a function of the number of language model calls. So a standard set of success metrics, right? Pass at n means you're going to give a language model n tries and see if it gets everything right at any of those times. And then with Parcel, there's a wrinkle in this, right? There's basically 2 types of generation. You can generate the Parcel program, and you can generate the code from the Parcel program. So if you do n of one and k of the other, the correct cost to compute here would be n times k. And so it turns out that if we look at the apps benchmark of competition level problems, we're able to, by a considerable margin, get the state of the art in code completion as a function of the sample budget here you're seeing on the x-axis, and on the y-axis the completion of these problems. We also checked the human eval benchmark, and we compared GPT-4 with GPT-4 plus Parcel, right? So Parcel is going to work with any underlying LLM engine. And so you can see that it considerably does, as a function of different sample budgets, is able to outstrip GPT-4. So robotic plans. How good is Parcel at generating desired robotic plans? So we use the virtual home benchmark for this. It works with a strict grammar of possible actions in the environment. Following previous LLM-based virtual home work, we prompt for a plan. We can check for executability using the virtual home. And then we need to use human raters to compare desirability of robotic plans. It's a limitation, I think, of this current language model work, and a lot of such work where we need to rely on human raters to judge desirability of plans. We do see that over baseline, it's able to considerably outperform it, both in terms of accuracy of the robotic plan as well as clarity in the robotic plan. So I'm quite emboldened by these sorts of ideas, right? Code and how we code gives us these powerful abstractions useful for goal formation and planning. I won't go into the details of this work for the sake of time, but code generation also appears to be a very useful way to ground hypothesis generation and selection. So this is work that was led by Rochang together with Eric, Gabe, Evan, and Noah. And it was in inductive reasoning. And here you get a number of examples, and you want to come up with hypotheses for those examples. We had this method, which is quite simple. You have a language model come up with hypotheses for inductive reasoning, and then you have it generate code that implements those hypotheses in order to test it. And it turns out that this two-step process is very good. It's able to outperform GPT-4 by a considerable margin on the abstract reasoning challenge benchmark. So I'll just leave you with this last bit here. Could code serve as a useful substrate for making the autonomous agent? Thanks.
We'll move to questions. I'm going to use my moderator power and ask you some of my questions first.
Okay.
The first is around benchmarks. So you talk a lot about various benchmarks in your talk. And it looks like, especially like Parcel, you're able to outperform a lot of the baselines. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like these benchmarks are adequate to test for things like curiosity and play, or are there new benchmarks we need?
I think there's very much new benchmarks that we need. That's a fantastic question, right? Like I'm very much a benchmark guy. I guess I've said it a lot in the talk, right? Like I think that, right, like making the right sorts of benchmarks has really powered forward artificial intelligence, right? The prime example of that being ImageNet, computer vision, right? Allowed you to make incredible progress by asking the right questions of our performance of AI systems. In the domain of reinforcement learning, in particular, these sorts of intrinsic motivation reinforcement learning, we don't really have, we have some benchmarks, but it's sort of, there's a lot of them. There's like a real flurry of different possible benchmarks. And there's a real challenge in figuring out what are good ones. So I think that very much within this sort of embodied interactive AI, we are grasping desperately for like making the right sorts of benchmarks to really understand how well how we should make these systems. In code generation, I think we're also in a pretty tough place. You know, I mentioned, for instance, the human eval benchmark. One thing that you see in the world of language models in particular is you get this contamination, right? It's likely the case that current models have seen the human eval benchmark. And so our performance on it isn't necessarily completely what you think it is. And you know, I know that like companies that are building code generation systems internally are struggling with this question: how do I benchmark this? How do I benchmark this? And I think broadly in this wild new domain of generative AI, it's very challenging to benchmark things. You see that we're relying a lot on human evaluation in order to benchmark things. There's a big problem to be solved here in figuring out like better ways to benchmark systems than asking people is A or do you prefer A or B? So okay, long question, but I think yeah, it's a really key question because we're at a tough spot here.
Good, thank you. And then my other question is more on the first half of your talk. You talk about being inspired by how humans think and play to build better AI. Are there aspects you've learned from building that AI that help better understand how humans play or their brain works?
That's the dream, right? I don't think that we've really thoroughly closed that loop as of yet, right? There's a number of, I think, right, the hope is that you build an AI baby and you can use that model to understand how babies actually develop, right? And you can do these in silico experiments, right? Of okay, if I introduce play in this way, or there's this sort of environment, what happens? I think a really ambitious dream and like a really exciting way forward. You know, where we've gotten so far with that sort of thing is we've had collaborations with developmental psychologists to collect large-scale baby data. So people like Mike Frank in psychology are collecting these incredible data sets of baby play data. And I think that we need to like use those sorts of data potentially also with neural data, though that's very expensive, to kind of triangulate things and be able to come up with these sorts of models of humans. I should also say at this point, I think that there are a lot of like engineering reinforcement learning challenges, which make us fairly constrained in how we can build these models of play. But I think that the strategy is you have to push on data generation of human behaviors while pushing on the engineering and hoping that they kind of triangulate over time. Yeah.
Question from online. So interesting. Our top question is kind of that LLM question that you said everyone asks. So I'm going to ask it, but maybe we can go a little further. So the question is from David. It says, will AI agents be able to capture all of these social play cues through LLM models? Maybe we can also expand, perhaps through LLM and reinforcement learning. Are there other things we need?
Right. Yeah, I think LLMs do offer a lot of really interesting human priors in being able to understand play dynamics, behaviors. I think there are a lot of things that are challenging right now in using those. One thing that comes to mind, I was just talking with a very frustrated student of mine because he's currently working on using language models to make student simulators, and it's very difficult to get a language model to realistically do a knowledge trace. So you can imagine if you're trying to teach it something, whether that's playing with the physical world, or solving a math problem, it's hard to get it to realistically act like a child learning. I mean, unresolved, I think it's possible for that to work, but it seems to be quite hard. That said, I mean, I think language models do introduce really useful priors in figuring out the right affordances of objects I can sort of play. I can use that to help me inform play. I should say from another angle, I guess we kind of believe that a bit of this is really just kind of intrinsically motivated curiosity, that we play because we are trying to understand our worlds or trying to seek out novelty. So we think of the reinforcement learning approach as being very complementary, and actually if you want to make baby-like play behavior, you sort of need some of both. Yeah.
So we'll go to audience questions. If you have a question, please step up to the mic. Oh, yeah.
I'm curious on your intuition of language models and their internal world model, maybe because Parcel and Codex and stuff, they are assuming they're using some sort of notion of world model to plan and execute, and they're you're just providing context.
Right.
So do you feel that they have a really strong sort of meta learned world model, and then in context it sort of adapts this world model to a given space that you're defining? Or is it just, is that how you think this works, or however you think it works?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And you might be familiar with there was some recent work on Othello that tries to get at this question: does a language model have a world model? Is it able to learn that through data? I think I'm going to claim some level of ignorance in having an intuition for this. I think that there's something very hard here, which is in interrogating what it means for a system to have a language model seems to be quite difficult. And I think there's after a couple of results such as this Othello paper have come out, there's been a lot of debate as to what it means to interrogate a language model to see whether it has a world model. And I feel I don't really understand what a good answer to that is at this point. It's a great question. I think one that a lot of people are very excited about. We're interested, for instance, I've been talking with a rotating student around making code-based world models with language models, and I think it's a really exciting direction, but a bit messy right now. Yeah.
Questions from the audience?
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. This was a great presentation. Thank you. I think from a very naive standpoint, in terms of using Parcel and the other, techniques, right, with LLMs, are you advocating for this particular aspect, using LLMs primarily for code generation as autonomous agents? We're doing some work as well with GSE actually on, modeling some ITT behaviors. But is code generation primarily used as a policy to, generate these agents? Because I'm trying to understand how curiosity can be modeled, as a piece of code.
Piece of code, right. Yeah, I think it's a again, a really great question. I think I don't have like a super strong handle on that just yet. I mean, I think we're seeing some really interesting signals. Language models seem to be good at coding, especially if you can scaffold them in the right ways. There are a lot of rich abstractions that coding provides. And coding does, like, you can execute code, so you can do things like come up with a plan or an algorithm or something that implements your idea. And unlike other aspects of language models, you can then execute it and do something with that. So it seems to be really useful as a way for an agent to do things like test hypotheses under test cases, or come up with how it thinks the system is working, and actually test that by executing the code. So the execution is basically a really very useful part of this relative to other aspects of language models. So as a result of that execution, it seems like a very useful tool that we can use for planning, for abstraction in decision making. But how precisely you do that, I think is really exciting new research.
I think that's a really good point. I think testing a known hypothesis is a much more, I guess, clearer path to validation than coming up with a completely new conjecture or something. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. There is something about I keep saying grounding, right? Because we think of like grounding in the case of like development, as you're like learning a language, you're grounding things with your own experience. But you can kind of likewise ground these abstractions in like hypothesis selection generation by having code that you can actually execute, and that allows you to like allows you to have a certain rigor to your hypotheses as you're generating them, and your plans as you're generating them.
And then do a question from online and then another from the audience. So audience, think of your questions and step up to the mic. So the next question from online is, for the first project, what was the best intrinsic motivation that led to best understanding of the rules? And how was that best intrinsic motivation coded in?
Yeah, so I think we're in a tough spot right there right now, where I think for certain sorts of environments, we saw some like one clear winner, and other sorts of environments we saw another clear winner. So in the social attention work that I referenced, in which you have this, it's like a model of a baby in the middle of a room, and it has a bunch of things around it, and needs to understand what it should look at in order to learn about its surroundings. In that case, making some estimate of the progress that you can possibly make by looking at a given stimulus seemed to work really well. Now, it's difficult to estimate progress. As I said, there's various approximation schemes for understanding, like, how much you're going to progress in a problem, or the information gain you expect from data. We use this funny technique we call gamma progress, which is basically that you have like basically you have your world model, and then you have a trailing world model, which is basically like it's like a geometrically decayed version of past world models that gets updated more slowly than the other. It's a technique that's used a lot in imitation learning, and you just sort of compute the difference. So basically, you have like old world model and new world model. How much should I get better? That appeared to really robustly be able to tell the difference between like things that it can learn from and things that are very noisy and it can't possibly learn from, much better than other techniques, such as disagreement, which I think I described in a little bit more detail in a talk. It's sort of a classical active learning technique where you take a bunch of copies of world models, try to understand, well, basically you then compute some notion of how much they disagree, and you use that as a proxy for uncertainty. So this is often called like an ensemble technique in active learning. And it turned out that in the social play behavior work, that seemed to be a good deal more robust than progress signals somehow. So I think I'm not sure if there's no free lunch here, but I think that there's clearly what's happening in order to make something that works robustly is really kind of complicated. I should say also that we've done some human subject work in trying to compare humans' ratings of what's interesting with these various intrinsic motivation signals. They're albeit adult humans, easier to ask them. And we're able to get fairly good again with kind of disagreement signals. Their disagreement is able to more closely correlate human preferences and interestingness. But there's still a much higher ceiling in how well we can do. So we're clearly not doing that well in matching human judgments of interestingness. So I think a lot of work to try to get systems which are robust in the ways humans are.
One more question. Is there any more questions from the audience?
Why did you decide to focus on intrinsic motivation in relation with the agent design? Because this is more specific to humans,
Mm-hmm.
the form of motivation, and why it was your choice.
Why do that for a robot?
Yeah.
Basically. Couple reasons. One, it's a great question. From one perspective, we're if you care about human learning, then you try to make these sorts of systems in order to better understand human learning. So towards that objective, it seems really there's the objective of understanding how humans learn and develop. Making these kinds of curious artificial agents should hopefully teach you things. And ideally, as I was talking about before with your question, is to actually be able to build an AI baby and do pretty incredible experiments in silico with those. But if you want to do it purely for the sake of making good artificial systems, I think there is still some good reason to want to make these intrinsically motivated systems. And that's it. We're kind of familiar with I don't know, this could be very 2019, but the bitter lesson, right? This notion that in making good artificial systems, it turns out over and over again, what you want to do is have simple learning rules, lots of data, and you exploit learning and compute and search, basically really scalable strategies for making systems, instead of having really hand-designed processes that say oh, this is how I think that we think, and we're going to make a system that that's tailored to how I think we think. Right, a key example of that would be in vision. Deep learning has worked really well. It's just data and generic methods. Whereas previous methods were all let's hand design features, let's try to take apart additionally complex pieces of how things are happening neurally to better understand how to make a visual system. And it was really just scale and data. And I think that a move towards intrinsic motivation is another such move. We can try to make artificial systems that have that are supervised on a huge set of human preferences, a huge set of potential human tasks, and kind of tailor how systems work so that they do well on those. Or you could try to have this generic optimization process where say that okay, this, and this are important for an agent, and everything else should be emergent. It's kind of a scary thing. You're saying okay, I want to give the agent drive, and then everything else is going to be emergent. But I do think it's from the standpoint of of better artificial intelligence is very much the way forward. So sort of this sort of like simplicity and data should kind of lead the way. And I think intrinsic motivation is another such lesson in that. It leads to a lot of interesting questions about like alignment, though, right? What is it? What drive should we give agents, right? It relates a lot to like constitutional AI that has been in vogue a lot lately.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you to the audience for coming. We do have a seminar next week as well. Same time, same place. Details are on the website, so hope to see you there.